the watch preserve, and we have Bryan again. Um, I asked him to take some time and go through the decades of Hamilton wristwatch design.
So I just want to go through the 7 decades of Hamilton wristwatch design, starting in the 19 teens around World War I, and take it up through the early 70s when Hamilton started phasing out U.S. production and assembly. So Hamilton's first men's wristwatch debuted in 1917. And it was a large O-size model with wire lugs. This design was popular around World War I with men going off to fight the war and men who'd come back from the war. The large size watches only lasted for a few years, and starting kind of in the 1920s, sizes got much smaller, and Hamilton started producing a 6.0 size cushion wristwatch. This was their first small wristwatch, which came out in 1922.
When did they switch from the wire lug to those?
The wire lug to the conventional lugs with regular spring bars happened around 1921 or so.
Okay.
So for the first few years in the 1920s, Hamilton just went with 2 basic case designs, this cushion and the square. And then starting about 1927, it expanded its line to include additional geometric shaped watches, which included the tonneau, this model, and the barrel, and the oval. So Hamilton stayed with these basic geometric designs until about 1928, when they really took a huge leap forward in style and design with the introduction of the piping rock in 1928 with the enamel bezel. Also with the piping rock in 28 came the spur with the enamel bezel, and of course the coronado. And these watches were, they started moving away from watch design names such as square, cushion, oval to fancier names that were mainly designed to appeal to a more affluent crowd. So the piping rock was named after a famous country club in New York.
So was there a big price jump in that transition?
There absolutely was. The tonneau in Goldfield was about $55 in 1928. When the piping rock comes along that same year, the price jumps up to $125.
Oh, okay, so almost.
So they were definitely targeting wealthier, more affluent people who would go to country clubs, who belonged to country clubs, who played golf, who played tennis, things like that.
Did it help their popularity too?
It established them as the watch of the higher class.
Okay.
Yeah. Other companies like Elgin and Waltham, they were making 7-jewel movements. They were making watches that cost $13 or $14 at the same time.
Yeah.
So Hamilton was definitely targeting a more affluent crowd.
With design kind of innovation.
Design, higher jewel movements, and higher cost.
Yeah.
Elgin and Waltham, none of their solid gold watches didn't cost anywhere near what Hamilton's cost at the time. Moving on to the 30s, Hamilton began producing tonneau-shaped movement that allowed for longer, thinner styled cases, square cases that are slightly more curved. So for instance, here in 1937, they began producing the Gilman, which is a long, solid gold watch, curved. Same thing here with the Richmond. Again, long, narrow, curved, smaller cases. Since they weren't using a round case, the cases could be much thinner, which was the design trend for the time in the 30s. Smaller, sleeker, streamlined, 1930s. Moving into the 40s, you start to begin to see an influence of military-styled watches. So with World War II starting in 1939, Swiss companies and other companies were making watches that were very utilitarian for soldiers. So you needed something round, easy to see numbers. And so even though the U.S. hadn't entered the war yet, companies like Hamilton and Elgin began producing military-styled watches. So starting in the late 30s and really continuing through the 40s, you see the Endicott model, which has a round case, 987 movement. This is a fancier model with gold numbers, but they also produced one with a plain luminous dial, which would have been very useful for military people.
Yeah, Arabic numerals.
Correct.
Yeah.
And of course, soon after we got into the war, Hamilton began shifting production to producing watches for the U.S. military.
Yeah.
So Hamilton made hundreds and hundreds of thousands of wristwatches for the American Armed Forces, and in this case, for the Royal Canadian Air Force.
That's Royal Canadian Air Force, yeah.
It is.
Much more scarce, I'm guessing.
Very rare. Yeah. Of course, then the war ends, and we kind of go back to more conventional civilian styling. Here we have a Curtis, which came out in the early 50s. Square, but with a fancy dial. The dial's got some texture to it. It's got alternating numerals and pyramid gold markers, and it's got flexible lugs. Here we have, again, a Gordon, which started in the 40s but was huge in the 50s with Hamilton. You see a lot of Gordons from the 50s, most of which were done as corporate presentations. So you've got, which was very common in the 50s. You work 30 or 40 years somewhere, retire, good chance you would get a 18 karat solid gold Hamilton Gordon for your retirement with your name on the back or in your years of service to your company. So that was very common. So Hamilton stayed with this conventional 50s styling through about 1954, 55. And then they started branching out into something a little more avant-garde. Here's a Kenmore with curly Q lugs, two-tone dial, elongated pyramid markers that are radiating out.
One question I have about case design on those two, actually. Is there improvement in waterproofing on some of these, even though they're similar styles? For example, like the tank or tonneau style?
Very little.
Very little.
Yeah, they're all snapback cases. Some of them have a dust guard in the crown. But that's mostly for dust protection, not water protection.
Okay, yeah. So
it wasn't until in the 50s when Hamilton began offering automatics, which had Swiss movements imported to the U.S. Well, with the round movements, then they were starting to do, screwback cases with the gasket, with crowns with gaskets, and plexiglass or acrylic crystals, press fit crystals. So then you would get into waterproofing.
Okay.
But as far as any of the tank style models, anything that wasn't round and automatic was completely non-waterproof. So starting in about 55, we start to see a trend towards something very avant-garde, space age, just off the top, triangular lugs, U-shaped lugs. So the watch head appears to be floating off the strap. Hamilton did a whole series of watches like this with large fan-shaped lugs, dial markers that accented the shape of the lugs and the angles of the lugs. This is a Viscount from 1955.
How uncommon is that model?
This is a rare model. So. Yeah. This is one of those models, used to see them, and they seem to have just dried up in the last 10 years. You start to realize stuff you thought was common 20 years ago, you realize is very rare now. Yeah. You just never see them. No. Never see them. Hamilton continued this trend, and in 1957, introduced the world's first battery-powered electric wristwatch. And in combination with that, they wanted something to really capture the public's interest. So they began using these space-age rocket-shaped designs, like with the Ventura and the Spectra. 1957.
There's something I noticed too with that kind of switch, black and gold.
That's huge 50s. That's pure 1950s.
All 1950s.
All 1950s, especially with the wild cases, gold cases, black dials, odd lugs. That's very 50s Mad Men design, all that. Yeah, that's all pure 50s.
The next one coming up too.
The next one coming up, yeah, it's a K475. So now we're getting into the early 60s. And automatic movement, this one is waterproof. But again, you have asymmetric lugs. You have an asymmetric dial.
Funky and beautiful.
Yeah, and you've got textured dial, and the texture on the dial, on the lugs carries on to the texture of the dial, all asymmetrical.
Was that a 60s change?
That's the 60s, yeah.
Texturing?
Yeah, and because now we're moving towards round dials.
Yeah.
When I think 1960s watches, I think round dialed automatics. Gold fill, solid gold. Not so much stainless steel, but you're still going with gold and gold fill because now a watch like this and these other black dialed or even silver dialed gold round watches. I'm thinking business lunch with a couple of martinis and
Yeah.
things like that. Yeah, IBM, AT&T, General Electric. That's what I think of the 1960s American businessmen watch.
A watch that stands out and
A watch that stands
corporate
out, yeah.
brush.
Peeking out from the coat sleeve at lunch or dinner, yeah, at the board meeting. Then in 1960-61, Hamilton went really wild and came up with dials that had genuine
Crazy.
wood dials. There was a long, tedious, not entirely successful process to produce a dial made out of wood. They had worked and worked and worked to make the wood so thin that you wouldn't have to alter the case design to accommodate a much thicker dial that was stronger. So they put a lot of research and a lot of experimentation into producing a dial that was thin enough to work in a regular watch.
And how do they in a sense, keep it from drying out also? That's...
like the dials are actually brass, and then the wood veneer is glued onto the brass, and it's paper thin.
Paper thin.
And then they would lacquer them like any other dial to seal it. But after 50, 60 years, some of that sealant starts to dry out, and then the wood starts to dry out, and you get flaking of the lacquer. The printing will come off, so it's very rare to find pristine dials.
That's what I
noticed. The wood series,
immediately about these is that the only dials I've ever had from Hamilton like that were just destroyed.
Sometimes they'll pick up oil from the movement on the underside and stain.
Wow.
Yeah. If the watch is not maintained or if it's been overoiled by the watchmaker, it can ruin the dial.
And how many years did they?
They made them for 1 year.
1 year. Wow. Incredible.
Then in the very late 60s, Hamilton started to phase out production at its Lancaster plant in Pennsylvania. And we believe this is the coin watch that came out in 1969. We believe this was the last model that was entirely produced and assembled at the Hamilton factory in Pennsylvania.
Wow.
After that, Hamilton continued to produce models at its, more probably accurate to say they would assemble models at the Hamilton factory. By that time in the early 70s, it's all Swiss movements imported.
Yeah.
So they were still doing some assembly in Lancaster, but they weren't making movements in the Lancaster plant. They had some left over from the 70s mechanical movements that they would assemble. Most of those went into award watches.
Okay.
That were just done for corporations, were not advertised in the Hamilton's regular catalog line for public sale. All the catalogs starting in 1970, 71, all the movements in those watches are Swiss.
Okay, yeah. But still a good chunk of assembly going on
in Hamilton, in Pennsylvania.
U.S. factory.
Right. So you would see something like this in Hamilton's catalog from the 70s, this 70s panda chronograph, obviously with the Swiss movement, Swiss case, Swiss dial, but assembled in Pennsylvania and sold through Hamilton's regular line. So that's kind of the highlights of Hamilton's wristwatch design from the teens through the 1970s.
Very cool. Thank you for taking the time to do it.